All right, let's talk about something uncomfortable but important. History isn't just about the past, it's a warning. People like to think they would never take part in something horrific, that they'd stand up against evil, but reality is messier. Most of us aren't heroes or villains. We're just people. And people, under the right pressures, can end up doing terrible things. That's exactly what happened with a group of German policemen in World War II. They weren't hardcore Nazis. They weren't brainwashed teenagers raised on Hitler's propaganda. They were regular middle-aged men, fathers, husbands, guys who grew up before the Nazi regime took over. And yet, when the time came, they became killers. Not all at once, but step by step. Here's the disturbing part. They had a choice. Their commander told them, straight up, that they didn't have to participate. No punishment, no threats. If they wanted to walk away, they could. Almost none did. Why? That's what we're going to break down. Not to excuse them, but to understand. Because if we don't, we make the same mistake. Assuming evil is something out there, something that only happens to other people. But history shows us that's not true. Under the right conditions, ordinary people can become part of something horrifying. And if we want to stop that from happening again, we need to face one brutal fact. These men weren't monsters. They were human, just like us. Who were these men before the war? Before they became killers, they were just regular guys. These men were part of Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of middle-aged German policemen. Most were working class, bus drivers, dock workers, small business owners. They weren't elite soldiers. They weren't fanatical Nazis. Many weren't even members of the Nazi Party. They had grown up in Germany before Hitler took over, meaning they weren't raised in the full force of Nazi propaganda like the younger generation. So how did they end up in Poland, executing civilians? Their recruitment wasn't glamorous. It was war. Germany had just invaded Poland in 1939, and they needed men to maintain order in the occupied territory. These policemen weren't frontline soldiers. They were supposed to handle security, patrolling streets, guarding prisoners, keeping civil control. First, that's exactly what they did. But soon their job changed. Orders came down. They were told to round up Jewish men, separate them from their families, and put them on trains. Deportation, they were told, was necessary for the war effort. Many of them followed orders without much resistance. After all, they weren't killing anyone, not yet. At this stage, most of them could still tell themselves they weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't pulling the trigger. They weren't committing direct violence. They were just following procedures, just keeping the peace. But step by step, that line kept moving. And before they knew it, their job wasn't just rounding people up. It was extermination. One step at a time. How they became killers. First, they weren't murderers. They were just following orders. They rounded up Jewish men, women, and children, loaded them onto trains, and sent them off. It was just deportation. They told themselves they weren't the ones pulling the trigger. But that changed. One day, new orders came. This time, they weren't just rounding people up. They were told to execute them. Villages were emptied, and instead of being sent to camps, people were marched into fields or forests and shot. Women, children, the elderly, entire families. And here's the shocking part. They didn't have to do it. Their commander, Major Wilhelm Trapp, gave them a choice. He told them that if they couldn't handle it, they could step aside. No punishment, no consequences. Almost no one did. Why? It wasn't because they enjoyed it. Many of them were physically ill after their first executions. Some cried, some shook, but they kept going. Not because they were forced, but because they felt pressure to conform. They didn't want to look weak in front of their comrades. They told themselves it was just war, that if they didn't do it, someone else would. Each step made the next one easier. First, it was rounding people up. Then it was standing guard while others shot. Then it was pulling the trigger themselves. Eventually, killing became routine. The horror didn't hit all at once. It crept in, one small decision at a time. Why did they do it? Why didn't they just walk away? It wasn't because they were evil from the start. These were ordinary men, fathers, husbands, workers. But when placed in the right, or rather the wrong conditions, ordinary people can do monstrous things. One of the biggest reasons was obedience to authority. When a superior officer gives an order, most people follow it, even if it feels wrong. This was proven in the famous Milgram experiment, where people were told to administer electric shocks to a stranger. Most participants went all the way, even when they believed they were causing real harm. Why? Because an authority figure told them to. These policemen were in a war zone, taking orders from their commanders. The instinct to obey was strong. Then there was peer pressure. If they refused, someone else had to take their place. Walking away meant leaving the burden on their comrades. They didn't want to be seen as weak or cowardly. Some even worried about being shunned by the group. Another factor? Moral numbing. The first killing was the hardest. After that, each act of violence became easier. The horror became routine. They stopped seeing the people they killed as individuals, just targets in a job that had to be done. And step by step, they transformed. Not all at once. Not because they wanted to, but because they took one step and then another until they had gone too far to turn back. How do regular people, men with families, normal lives, end up committing atrocities? The answer is simple. They rationalize it. At first, it starts with small justifications. I'm just rounding people up, not hurting them. Then it shifts. If I don't do it, someone else will. Eventually, it becomes, this is just the way things are. Each step feels minor, but together they lead to horror. This kind of rationalization happens everywhere. People convince themselves that wrong actions are necessary. We see this in history, but also in everyday life. Employees go along with unethical business practices because that's just the company culture. Soldiers follow brutal orders because it's just war. It's not that these people set out to do evil. It's that they adjust to each new level of wrongdoing, one step at a time. And here's the disturbing part. Once people commit one immoral act, they're more likely to commit another. Psychologists call this the foot in the door effect. If you get someone to agree to something small, they're more likely to agree to something bigger later. The police in Battalion 101 didn't start as killers. But after rounding people up, guarding execution sites, and standing by while others pulled the trigger, it became easier to take the next step. Doing it themselves. Understanding this isn't about excusing it. It's about recognizing how dangerous small moral compromises can be. Because history proves that no one is immune, not even ordinary men. Why this still matters. Today, this isn't just history, it's a warning. People like to think they're different, that they'd never go along with something horrific, that they'd stand up, speak out, do the right thing. But reality says otherwise. Most people don't resist. They comply. Not because they're evil, but because they convince themselves they have no choice. Think about peer pressure. It's not just a schoolyard problem, it's everywhere. In workplaces, people stay quiet about unethical decisions because they don't want to stand out. In politics, people go along with the majority to avoid backlash. In society, people justify small wrongs because everyone else is doing it. That's how it starts. No one wakes up and decides to be part of something terrible. They just take one small step at a time. This is why understanding Battalion 101 is so important. It shows how easily ordinary people can be led into extraordinary cruelty. Not because they were born that way, but because they stopped questioning where the next step would take them. So, what can we do? Be aware. Recognize when something feels wrong. Pay attention to small moral compromises. Have the courage to say no even when it's uncomfortable. History shows that following the crowd is easy. Standing against it takes real strength. Because if we assume it could never happen again, we're not learning from the past, and that's exactly how it happens again. History isn't just about the past, it's a mirror. And what we see in Battalion 101 is uncomfortable. These men weren't monsters, not at first. They were ordinary. And that's the most terrifying part. They had a choice. They could have walked away, but most didn't. They stayed, step by step, until killing became normal. It's easy to judge them, to say, I would never do that. But would you? If your friends, your coworkers, your superiors were all going along with something, would you be the one to step out of line? That's the real lesson. Evil doesn't announce itself. It creeps in disguised as duty, as necessity, as just the way things are. It asks for small compromises, justifications, silence. Until one day, the line is so far behind you that you don't even remember stepping over it. So what do? We stay awake. We recognize how these things happen, not just in war, but in everyday life. We notice when people stop questioning, when moral lines start shifting, when silence becomes easier than speaking up. Because history isn't just something to remember. It's something to learn from. And if we're not careful, we'll make the same mistakes. Not all at once, just one small step at a time. The choice is always there. The question is, will we see it before it's too late?